Good day everyone, I am Aira Sasing from Bsed Social Studies 2 today, and today I will be discussing the chapter 17, the Revolution and the Enlightenment. So I will be the one to discuss the section 3 and 4 of the chapter 17. So section 3, the impact of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment ideas had an impact on the politics and arts of 18th century Europe. While they liked to talk about enlightened reforms, most rulers were more interested in the power and stability of their nations. Their desire for balancing power, however, could also lead to war. The 7 Years' War became global as war broke out in Europe, India, and North America. Enlightenment and absolutism. Main idea. Philosophers believe that in order to reform society based on Enlightenment ideals, people should be governed by the enlightened rulers. So European politics were impacted by the Enlightenment ideas in the 18th century. Natural rights, equality before the law, as the American Declaration of Independence expressed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all were recognized by the philosopher for everyone. Then these rights included the ability to assemble, own property, pursue happiness, and the freedom of speech and the press. They also included that men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most philosophers strive to promote and protect these natural rights. It is believed that intelligent rulers were necessary to manage the populace. Enlightened rulers are those who allowed religious toleration, journalistic freedom, and private property rights. So they nurture education, the sciences, and the arts. Above all, enlightened rulers uphold the law and do it fairly for all people. Only powerful, wise rulers could enact reform society. Enlightened absolutism. Many historians believe that a new kind of monarchy, which they referred to as to enlightened or the Enlightenment ideas. So did Europe's rulers, however, actually follow the advice of the philosophers and become enlightened? So to answer this question, we examine 3 states, the Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Prussia, army and bureaucracy. 2 able Prussian kings, Frederick William I and Frederick II, made Prussia a major European power in the 18th century. Frederick William I maintained a highly efficient bureaucracy of civil service workers. So they observed the supreme values of obedience, honor, and above all, service to the king. So as Frederick William asserted, one must serve the king with life and limb, and surrender all except salvation. The latter is reserved for God, but everything else must be mine. Frederick William's major concern was the army. So by the end of his term, he doubled the size of army. Prussia was 10th in physical size and 13th in population in Europe. It had the 4th largest army after France, Russia, and Austria. The Prussian army is considered as one of the best in Europe. Members of the nobility who owned large land estates with many serfs were the officers in the Prussian army. So these officers too had a strong sense of service to the king or state. As Prussian nobles, they believe in duty, obedience, and sacrifice. So Frederick II or Frederick the Great was one of the best educated and most cultured monarchs of the time. Then Frederick II ruled Prussia from 1740 until his death, leading his nation through multiple wars with Austria and its allies. His daring military tactics expanded and consolidated Prussian lands, while his domestic policies transformed his kingdom into a modern state and formidable European power. So as an enthusiastic patron of the arts and sciences, a gifted musician and a correspondent with the top minds of the Enlightenment, Frederick sought to embody the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king. And Frederick seems to be very open to implementing significant reforms, except in cases of treason. He abolished the use of torture and murders, so he also granted limited freedom on press and speech as well as more tolerance towards religion. However, Frederick refrained from making any further reforms, maintaining the serf system and strict social structure of Prussia. The Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire had become one of the great European states by the start of the 18th century. It was hard to rule, however, because it was a sprawling empire composed of many nationalities, languages, religions, and cultures. Empress Maria Theresa, who inherited the throne in 1740, worked to centralize and strengthen the state. So Maria Theresa was the elder daughter of Emperor Charles VI and Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. However, she was not brought up as a future ruler, since the couple kept on hoping for a long time that they might still have a son. So when it became certain that no male heir could be expected any longer, so the search began at the Venice court for a capable husband for the heiress who would rule in her name. Maria Theresa became the heir to the throne of Austria and Hungary, thanks to the pragmatic sanction of 1713 that made it possible for a daughter to inherit the throne if there were no sons. So when Maria Theresa died, her son Joseph II assumed the full responsibility as emperor. Joseph believed in the need to sweep away anything standing in the path of reason. So I have made philosophy the lawmaker of my empire. Joseph's reforms were far-reaching. He abolished serfdom and eliminated the death penalty. He established the principle of equality of all before the law and enacted religious reforms, including religious toleration. In his effort to change Austria, Joseph issued thousands of decrees and laws. Joseph's reform program largely failed. He alienated the nobles by freeing the serfs. He alienated the Catholic Church with his religious reforms. Even the serfs were unhappy because they could not understand the drastic changes. Joseph soon realized his failure when he wrote his own epitaph for his gravestone. Here lies Joseph II, who was unfortunate in everything that he undertook. Epitaph is a text inscribed on a tombstone. So his successors undid almost all of Joseph II's reforms. Catherine the Great. So in Russia, Peter the Great was followed by 6 weak successors who were often put in power and deposed by the palace guard. So a group of nobles murdered the last of these 6 successors, Peter III. So his German wife emerged as ruler of all the Russians. Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, so ruler of Russia. So Catherine the Great was an obscure German princess in 1744 when Elizabeth of Russia chose her to be the wife of Russia's future king, Peter III. Peter's foolish acts as king made him many enemies. So Catherine, however, was popular among her husband's opponents, who overthrew Peter in 1762 and proclaimed Catherine queen. So Catherine became a strong ruler, working to increase Russia's power and influence. She extended Russian territory by partitioning Poland. She tried to break up the Ottoman Empire in a series of wars attempting to gain its lands for Russia. She was an intelligent woman who was familiar with the works of the philosophers and seemed to favor enlightened reforms. She invited Denis Diderot, a French philosopher who traveled to Russia and was urged to speak frankly as man to man. which he did, outlining a program reforms. However, Catherine had doubts on Diderot's unworkable theories. She remarked she remarked would have turned Catherine remarked that it would have turned everything in my kingdom upside down. So she did contemplate the concept of a new code that would recognize the principle of the equality of all individuals in the eyes of the law. In the end, however, Catherine did nothing because she knew that her success depended on the support of the Russian nobility. Then Catherine's policy of favoring the landed nobility led to worse conditions for the Russian peasants and eventually to rebellion. Then it led by an illiterate Cossack, Russian warrior Yemelyan Pogakov. So the rebellion spread across southern Russia but soon collapsed. So Catherine took stronger measures against the peasants. All rural reform was halted, serfdom was expanded into newer parts of the empire. Of the rulers we have discussed, only Joseph II sought truly radical changes based on the Enlightenment ideas. So both Frederick II and Catherine II like to talk about enlightened reforms. So they even attempted some, but their interest in strengthening the state and maintaining the existing system took priority. So in fact, all three of these enlightened absolutists, Frederick, Joseph, and Catherine, were guided primarily by their interest in the power and welfare of their state. So when they did manage to strengthen their position as rulers, they did not use their enhanced position to undertake enlightened reforms to benefit their subjects. Rather, their power was used to collect more taxes and thus to create armies to wage wars and to gain even more power. The philosophers condemned war as a foolish waste of life and resources. So despite their words, the rivalry among states that led to costly struggles remained unchanged. So in 18th century Europe's self-governing individual states were chiefly guided by the self-interest of the rulers. The 18th century monarchs were concerned with the balance of power, so this concept proposed that states should have equal power in order to prevent anyone from dominating the others. So this desire for a balance of power, however, did not imply a desire for peace. Large armies created to defend the state's security were often used to conquer new lands as well. So as Frederick II of Prussia remarked, the fundamental rule of governments is the principle of extending their territories. The 7 Years' War. Austrian succession. So when the Austrian Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir, so his daughter Maria Theresa succeeded him. Then King Frederick II of Prussia took advantage of the confusion surrounding the succession of a woman to the throne by invading the Austrian Silesia. By this action, Frederick clearly stated that he did not recognize the legitimacy of the Empress of Austria. France then entered the war against Austria, its traditional enemy. In turn, Maria Theresa allied with Great Britain. The War of the Austrian Succession. The War of the Austrian Succession was fought in 3 areas of the world. In Europe, Prussia seized Silesia, while France occupied the Austrian Netherlands. In Asia, France took Madras, or today called the Chennai, and India from the British. In North America, the British captured the French fortress of Louisbourg at the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. 7 years of conflict have ended, and all parties accepted the treaty in 1748 of Aix-la-Chapelle, the agreement guaranteeing the return of all seized territories with the exception of Silesia to its owners. Prussia's refusal to return Silesia indicated a new conflict between Prussia and Austria. Maria Theresa resisted acknowledging defeat of Silesia while working diplomatically to separate Prussia, its principal ally, the France. She reinforced her army. So in 1756, her expectations were realized when a diplomatic revolution reversed two long-standing alliances. War in Europe. New rivalries now replaced the old one, the rivalry of Britain and France over colonial empires and the rivalry of Austria and Prussia over Silesia. So since Prussia successfully separated with its principal alliance, the France abandoned Prussia and allied with the Austria and Russia. So in turn, Britain allied with Prussia. So this diplomatic revolution of 1756 led to another worldwide war. The war had three major areas of conflict: the Europe, India, and the North America. Europe witnessed the clash of the major alliances: the British and Prussians against the Austrians, Russians, and the French. Frederick the Great of Prussia, with the use of his great tactics, his army and military skill, was able to defeat the Austrian, French, and the Russian armies for a time. Frederick faced disaster until Peter III, a new Russian Tsar, who greatly admired Frederick, withdrew Russian troops from the conflict and from the Prussian lands that the Russians had occupied. So this withdrawal created a stalemate and led to the desire for peace. The European War ended in 1763. All occupied territories were returned to their original owners except Silesia. Austria officially recognized Prussia's permanent control of Silesia. The war in India. The struggle between France and Britain that occurred throughout the world had more decisive outcomes. It was fought in India and North America, was known as the Great War for Empire. The French were back after the War of the Austrian Succession. Madras was given to Britain, but the struggle in India persisted. So the British finally won, not because of their soldiers were better, but rather because they were more persistent. The war in North America. The greatest conflicts of the 7 Years' War took place in North America. On the North American continent, the French and the British colonies were set up differently. The French government administered French North America, Canada, and Louisiana as a vast trading area. So it was valuable for its fur leather, fish, and timber. Because the French state was unable to get people to move to North America, its colonies were thinly populated. British North America consisted of 13 prosperous colonies on the eastern coast of what is now the United States. The British and French fought over two main areas in North America. One consisted of the waterways of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which were protected by the fortress of Louisbourg and by forts that guarded French Quebec. The other area they fought over was the unsettled Ohio River Valley. The French began to move down from Canada and up from Louisiana to establish forts in the Ohio River Valley. This French activity threatened to cut off the British settlers in the 13 colonies from expanding into this vast area. So the French were able to gain the support of the Native Americans who lived there. As traders and not settlers, the French were viewed by Native Americans with less hostility than the British. The French scored a number of victories at first, British versions were revived, however, by the efforts of William Pitt the Elder, Britain's Prime Minister. Pitt was convinced that the French colonial empire would have to be destroyed for Britain to create its own colonial empire. Pitt's policy focused on doing little in the European theater of war while putting resources into the colonial war, especially through the use of the British Navy. The French had more troops in North America, but not enough naval support. The defeat of French fleets in major naval battles gave the British an advantage. Without their fleets, the French could not easily reinforce their forts. So a series of British victories soon followed. In 1759, British forces under General Wolfe defeated the French under General Montcalm on the plains of Abraham outside Quebec. Both generals died in the battle. The British went on to seize Montreal, the Great Lakes area, and the Ohio River Valley. So the French were forced to make peace. By the Treaty of Paris, the French transferred Canada and the lands east of the Mississippi to England. Spain, ally of the French, transferred Spanish Florida to British control. In return, the French gave their Louisiana territory to the Spanish. So by 1763, Great Britain had become the world's greatest colonial power. Enlightenment and arts. So let's talk about the architecture and art. The palace of Louis XIV at Versailles in France had made an enormous impact on Europe. The Austrian emperor, the Swedish king, and other European rulers also built grand residences. So these palaces were modeled more in the Italian Baroque style of the 15th century and 16th century. On the late 17th century, French classical style of Versailles. Thus a unique architectural style was created. Architects might choose traditional, classical, or any combination, but usually on a grand scale. One of the greatest architects of the 18th century was Balthasar Neumann. So Neumann's two masterpieces are the Church of the 14 Saints in southern Germany and the residence, the Palace of the Prince Bishop of Würzburg. In these buildings, secular and spiritual become one as lavish and fanciful ornament, light, bright colors, and elaborate detail greet the visitors. Inside the church, a pilgrim in search of holiness is struck by the incredible richness of the details. By the 1730s, however, a new artistic style known as Rococo had spread all over Europe. Unlike the Baroque style, which stressed grandeur and power, Rococo emphasized grace, charm, and gentle action. Rococo made use of delicate designs colored in gold with graceful curves. The Rococo design is a strong secular. Its grace and lightness spoke of pursuing happiness, pleasure, and love. Rococo's appeal is evident in the work of Anton Watteau. In his paintings, gentlemen and ladies in elegant dress reveal a world of upper-class pleasure and joy. Underneath that exterior, however, is an element of sadness. So the artist suggests such sadness in his paintings by depicting the fragility and passing nature of pleasure, love, and life. So one of his masterpieces, The Embarkation of Cetera, shows French Rococo at its peak. So the Embarkation of Cetera is also known as Voyage to Cetera and Pilgrimage to the Isle of Cetera. So the painting portrays a fête galante, an amorous celebration or party enjoyed by the aristocracy of France during the regents after the death of Louis XIV. which is generally seen as a period of dissipation and pleasure and peace after the somber last years of the previous reign. Another aspect of Rococo was a sense of enchantment and enthusiasm, especially evident in the work of Giovanni Battista Tipolo. He brought fresco painting to new heights of dramatic effect with numerous active figures that are arranged in vivid pastels across vast airy spaces. Many of Tipolo's paintings came to adorn the walls and ceilings of churches and palaces. His masterpiece, Allegory of the Planets and Continents, adorns the ceiling of the bishop's residence at Würzburg. Music. So 18th century Europe produced some of the world's most enduring music. In the first half of the century, two composers, Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel, stand out as musical geniuses. Bach, a renowned organist as well as composer, spent his entire life in Germany. While he was a music director at the Church of St. Thomas in Leipzig, he composed his Mass in B minor and other works that gave him the reputation of being one of the greatest composers of all time. Handel was a German who spent much of his career in England. He is probably best known for his religious music. Handel's Messiah has been called a rare work that appeals immediately to everyone and yet is a masterpiece of the highest order. Bach and Handel perfected the Baroque musical style. Two geniuses of the second half of the 18th century, Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, were innovators who wrote music called classical rather than Baroque. Haydn spent most of his adult life as musical director for wealthy Hungarian prince. He visits to England, introduced him into a world where musicians wrote for public concerts rather than princely patrons. So this liberty, as he called it, led him to write two great works, The Creation and The Seasons. Mozart was truly a child prodigy. His failure to get a regular patron to support him financially made his life miserable. Nevertheless, he wrote music passionately. His works, The Marriage of Figaro, The Magic Flute, and Don Giovanni are three of the world's greatest operas. Haydn remarked to Mozart's father, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me." Next, literature. So in the 18th century, European novelists began to choose realistic social themes over the past centuries' focus on heroic deeds and the supernatural. Novels were especially attractive to a growing number of middle-class readers. The English writer Henry Fielding wrote novels about people without morals who survive by their wits. So Fielding's best-known work is The History of Tom Jones, a foundling which describes the adventures of a young scoundrel. So in a number of hilarious episodes, Fielding presents the scenes of English life from the slums of London to the country houses of the English aristocracy. His characters reflect real types in 18th century English society. Social history. The 18th century salon. The French word salon refers to a parlor or living room, a main gathering space in a private home. In the 18th century, salons became gathering places for intellectual conversation. Writers, scientists, and philosophers meet weekly to discuss important discoveries and new works of poetry and theater. It is a golden age of conversation. So, Madame de Geoffrin made two important salon innovations. She focused on an early afternoon meal instead of a late dinner, allowing an entire afternoon of conversation. She also introduced a regular weekly schedule of themes, with days devoted to the visual arts and literature. She was remembered as a generous listener, and she had a talent for saying just enough at the right time to keep a conversation moving. Section 4, the American Revolution. Britain and the American Revolution. In 1707, the United Kingdom of Great Britain came into existence when the governments of England and Scotland were united. The term British came to refer both the English and the Scots. In 18th century, Britain, the monarch, and the parliament shared power, with parliament gradually gaining the upper hand. The monarch chose ministers who were responsible to the crown. So these ministers set policy and guided parliament. So having the power to make laws, levy taxes, and pass the budget, parliament indirectly influenced the ministers of the monarch. By 1714, a new dynasty, the Hanoverians, was established when the last Stuart ruler, Queen Anne, died without an heir. So the crown was offered to her nearest relatives. Protestant rulers of the German state of Hanover. So the first Hanoverian king, George I, did not speak English. Neither the first nor the second George knew the British system well. So their chief ministers were allowed to deal with parliament. Robert Walpole served as head of cabinet, later called prime minister from 1721 to 1740. So Walpole pursued a peaceful foreign policy. However, growing trade and industry led to an increasing middle class. So the middle class favored the expansion of trade and of Britain's world empire. They found a spokesman in William Pitt the Elder, who became the head of cabinet in 1757. He expanded the British Empire by acquiring Canada and India in the 7 Years' War. Britain then controlled Canada as well as the 13 colonies on the eastern coast of what is now the United States. The British colonies were well populated. They were also prosperous. The British Board of Trade the Royal Council, and Parliament in theory controlled the colonies. So in actuality, the colonies had legislatures that tended to act independently. Merchants in port cities such as Boston, New York City, and Charleston did not want the British government to run their affairs. The American Revolution begins. After the 7 Years' War, British leaders wanted to get new revenues from the colonies. These revenues would then be used to cover war costs. They would also pay for the expenses of maintaining an army to defend the colonies. In 1765, Parliament imposed the Stamp Act on the colonies. So the act required certain printed materials such as legal documents and newspapers to carry a stamp showing that a tax had been paid to Britain. Opposition was widespread and often violent, so the act was repealed in 1766, ending the immediate crisis, but the cause of the dispute was not resolved. Crisis followed crisis in the 1770s. So to counteract British actions, the colonies organized the First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia in September 1774. Members urged colonists to take up arms and organize militias. Fighting finally erupted between colonists and the British Army in April 1775 in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Meeting soon afterward, the Second Continental Congress set up an army called the Continental Army. George Washington served as its commander-in-chief. More than a year passed before the colonies declared independence from the British Empire. So on July 4, 1776, Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. With this steering a political document, the American Revolution had formally begun. The war against Great Britain was a huge gamble. Britain was a strong military power with enormous financial resources. The Continental Army of the Americans was made up of undisciplined civilians who agreed to serve for only a short time. Of great importance to the colonies' cause was support from foreign countries. So these nations were eager to gain revenge for earlier defeats at the hands of the British. The French supplied arms and money to the rebels. So French officers and soldiers also served in Washington's army. So in February 1778, following a British defeat, the French granted diplomatic recognition to the new United States. So when Spain and the Dutch Republic entered the war, the British faced war with the Europeans as well as the Americans. When General Cornwallis was forced to surrender to the American and French forces under Washington at Yorktown in 1781, the British decided to end the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the American colonies. The treaty also granted the Americans control of the Western Territory from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River. After the American Revolution, the founders of the new United States set up a system whereby its citizens could govern themselves. So they created the Bill of Rights to ensure individual liberties for future generations. Today, in the wake of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, security has become a top priority for many Americans. The birth of new nations. So after throwing off oppressive rule, the former colonies, now states, feared a strong central government. So thus their first constitution, the Articles of Confederation on 1781, created a government that lacked the power to deal with the nation's problems. So in 1787, delegates meet in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates decided to write a plan for an entirely new government. The Constitution. A federal system with a shared power structure between the federal and state governments was established by the proposed Constitution. The federal or national government was divided into the executive, legislative, and judicial branches in accordance with Montesquieu's theories. Each branch had the ability to control or regulate the actions of the others. So an executive branch, a president acted as the chief executive. So the Senate and the House of Representatives were the two houses that made up the legislative branch. So the judicial branch was composed of the Supreme Court and subordinate courts. The Constitution became effective after being approved by 9 out of the 13 states. The Bill of Rights. As promised during negotiations over ratification, the new Congress proposed 12 amendments to the Constitution. So the states approved 10 of the amendments. Together, these amendments became known as the Bill of Rights. So the 10 amendments guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly. So they gave Americans the right to bear arms and to be protected against unreasonable searches and arrests. So they guaranteed trial by jury, due process of law, in the protection of property rights. So many of the rights in the Bill of Rights were derived from the natural rights proposed by the 18th century philosophers. Many European intellectuals saw the American Revolution as the embodiment of the Enlightenment's political dreams. So the premises of the Enlightenment seemed confirmed. A new age and a better world could be achieved. So that's all for my discussion. Thank you.